I fought vulnerability with Janene's diagnosis and her initial decline for at least a year and a half or two. The truth be told, I was inspired not to write a book. I did not want to write a book. I would report on the latest sort of nuance of Janene's decline and the inevitable, what appeared to be the inevitable need for her to be institutionalized. And they were with me every step of the way.
Today, I get the opportunity to sit down with my friend and mentor, Jay Brenneman. He talks about his book, Take a Larger Way, Reflections of a Dementia Caregiver. It's quite a story you don't want to miss on today's CARTI Hopecast. Welcome to the CARTI Hopecast, where we explore stories that shape us, journeys of resilience, hope, and perseverance. We seek the lessons that emerge when we face the unexpected and find strength in the struggle. I'm Adam Head, the host of the podcast, and today I have the privilege of speaking with Mr. Jay Brenneman, personal and leadership development coach, clinical psychologist, founder of CARTI, and author of Take a Larger Way, Reflections of a Dementia Caregiver. Today, Jay shares his profound insights on navigating the emotional journey of dealing with dementia. Join us as we delve into his personal story and discover how we can find meaning in the face of loss. Jay, I'm thrilled to have you here today. Welcome to the CARTI Hopecast.
It's an honor to be here, Adam. Thank you.
This is a little surreal for me.
It is. For me too.
Since you are, in fact, my leadership coach. And so there is a certain amount of pressure that I'm used to being the one who's being asked the questions. So I really want to get this right. So I appreciate your grace in the process.
Well, you have it in advance. You can take that pressure off yourself anytime. That'll be fine.
Have we known each other for 5 years, 6 years now? I was trying to think. It was...
I was too. I would say it's at least 5 years. It's been a real privilege to be on the journey with you, actually, Adam. It's been good for me too.
I appreciate that. It has been transformative for me, and being able to read your book, which we're going to talk about today, was a privilege, getting even more insight into the person who has been my mentor and leadership coach. And so excited to be able to talk about this. Speaking of that.
Yes.
I've heard you say in some of our conversations that you didn't initially set out to write a book, but here we are. And you've already gotten encouraging feedback from the dementia caregiver community that it was really helpful to them. If you would provide some background on what inspired you to write this book and take others on this in-depth exploration of your own grief process.
Well, that's a good question, Adam. The truth be told, I was inspired not to write a book. I did not want to write a book. And I was in a group of supportive men. And I decided actually after I had gotten out of my clinical practice and shut it down, that I might want to practice what I had been preaching to my clinical clients, which was journaling. Yeah. So I started journaling, and a couple of these close friends said, "May we read what you're journaling?" And I said, "Not really. It's journaling." But they insisted, and so the genesis of the book was actually inspired by a small group of men that said, "Keep writing and stop thinking about writing a book. Just don't think about that these are chapters in books, but write."
And you kept going.
Mm-hmm. But the anecdote that actually was the inspiration was on the second floor of the Denver Art Museum. When I was looking at Monet's exhibit of The Truth in Nature, and I came into the second floor to be detailed about it and saw about 5 contributions of the haystack out of his series of 25 contributions of the haystack series.
Yeah.
And Monet's point is that the motif is not the object. That is, what's actually happening in a series is what's going on between the observer and the motif. Mm-hmm. And it was at that moment that it got clear to me why I was writing. Because I didn't want to write a book about dementia, and I actually didn't want to write a book about myself nor about Janene, but rather what's happening as we find ourselves in a circumstance and situation that might be really unwelcome and might be, in fact, plan B or C, rather than a description of the circumstance itself. Because, as you know, in the series that Monet captured, it was morning and afternoon and evening and fall, summer, snow, rain, winter, the seasons, and so the motif is not the issue, is not the focus, and so that's how it happened.
Well, it's woven together beautifully through the book. I found that the first time I read the book was because you're my leadership coach.
Felt like you had to?
I felt like I should, but I wanted to.
Yes.
Because I wanted to learn more about you and your own journey, because I'd heard bits and pieces. The second time I read it not because you're my leadership coach, but because it's a beautiful story. And it clearly took a lot of vulnerability to be able to write about your marriage to Janene, both before and after her dementia diagnosis. How has your experience with dementia shaped your perspective on vulnerability?
Well, Adam, it was, I fought vulnerability with Janene's diagnosis and her initial decline for at least a year and a half or two, because it was impossible for me to believe that a person who had taken as good a care of herself, as we might say, as she had for 30 years, would actually be, in common parlance, losing her mind. And so what's behind the resistance to accept a chronic disease like cancer that you're working with or with dementia is how vulnerable we actually are. That for all of our architecting and, initiating and education and so on, we actually have a remarkably little control over our lives.
We don't want to think about that.
And we don't want to think about it. And when you're married to that, as in chronic diseases and something like dementia and Alzheimer's, you resist the reality. But what's behind that is the deeper thing that I'm really, life happens to us. C.S. Lewis, the British writer, says it's not a matter of if, but when we will concede.
Yeah.
And dementia and any real life-altering disease is a big concession. So I learned really that embracing the vulnerability was what, that was the gift. Actually applies to a lot of areas of life.
Yeah.
Like child rearing, for example. Have you noticed?
I have noticed with 4 kids in multiple phases. I have certainly noticed. I'm sure I'll notice a lot more.
It doesn't change either.
I've heard that. Well, some of what you're talking about and in the various seasons, and I know you may get into this a little bit more with how this was not a diagnosis and then an event and then it's done and you move on or you move through it. I want to talk about what you unpack in different ways through the book, and that's the subject of ambiguous grief. Can you talk about what ambiguous grief means to you and how it entered your world whenever you were told your wife has dementia?
The grief experts in the clinical psych world talk about simple and complex grief. Like December the 2nd, as I remember, of 1992, my mother died in an automobile accident. And she was in really good health at 85. Great relationships with her 3 sons. I'm the youngest. A good enough relationship with my father in the community, in the church, and she was an RN. She was still doing a little bit of part-time work, but she died very quickly. And because the strength of the relationships, it was actually a simple grief. Like it was sudden and it was tragic and it was life-altering, obviously for my family. But that kind of grief is very different than losing a loved one, in the case of Alzheimer's and dementia, word by word, function by function, social discomfort by discomfort. It's amazing because this is the key word, there's no closure on it. In other words, the person is dying and losing their personhood, and the end is not in sight. So we've made a lot out of closure that I think I'm getting closure on this grief, or I should be getting closure, or I wish I had gotten closure. But it's a word we use in common parlance about grief and loss and cancer and dementia and Alzheimer's and accidents. That I need to do something to get closure.
Yeah, it's like we don't know what to do with that. Like we're maybe naturally hardwired to want that, but whenever there's that in-between space, it doesn't work so well.
Well, and to talk about gender for just a second, we men are really good at trying to solve a problem. Use our left brain and, kind of our engineering, architecting side, and you can't with a complicated grief. And dementia is a complicated grief and loss. There are a lot of things that are complicated losses and ambiguous. And what makes them ambiguous is that they can't be defined by clear medical terms or diagnostic terms or predictions. And our Catholic friends would say dementia puts us in liminal space, where you start off from the shoreline, but then the clouds and the fog comes in, and you can't tell exactly where you're going, and it's not clear how long it's going to take to get there, even if you did know. So we're not that well prepared, I don't think, generally speaking, to handle liminal space and complicated grief. It's a challenge. It was a big challenge for me.
Yeah.
But once I admitted to myself that that's what it was significantly easier. It took about 150 visits to Janene's memory care facility over 2 years.
When you say 150, so you remember the moment.
Yeah.
Is that more of an acceptance moment?
It was like not trying to get her to remember words. You remember when we did this vacation with the girls, Janene? And I got some excellent coaching, which was never again ask Janene if she remembers anything.
Was that early on in the process, and then it took the 150 to be able to?
It took me about 2 years.
Wow.
Until I was basically anxiety-free going to visit her. Like not thinking I needed to have some kind of interaction with her. And literally, I was just able to eventually just to sit with her.
As I've heard you talk about Janene, and it's throughout your book, you tell a lot of stories.
Yes.
One of your great quotes in the book is, "Every moment counts, and every memory is a thread in the tapestry of our lives." You tell stories throughout the book with beautiful imagery, moments on trails in the Rockies, long bike rides in the hill country of Texas.
Yes.
And so many more. How did you approach the concept of memories in the early years of your new reality of having a spouse with dementia versus now?
Well, in the first couple of years, to pick up on my earlier response, I blocked out most of the memories. Because they were too painful.
Yeah.
Actually. But it was a tipping point for me to begin to remember trips and vacations. And actually, my 3 daughters helped me with this, because when I was with them and their husbands, they would talk about things they had done before, with like a family, and they were happy about it.
Mm-hmm.
And remember when we used to do this, and when we went camping and you made us go backpacking, and which we didn't, of course.
Yeah.
But that's how they remembered
Sure,
it.
sure.
But it was really helpful because it started to turn the pain actually into memories, to use your word, Adam, because they were so difficult at the beginning, because the memory triggered, this is what my loss is. I will not have those kind of memories again. I can't build the next season of my life and anticipate what the last 20 years of my life with Janene would look like. If you lose a partner in cancer, dementia, slowly or quickly, it ends a sense of, well, the technical word is historicity. It ends the narrative of your story together, which is what makes memory so painful. Because you get to be my age, all us old people like talking about memories.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it took a number of years until I was free to do that. I am now.
So as your daughters were doing that, were they doing that because that was more healing for them to continue to remember and bring that up and connect the dots there versus, the pain of it?
My 3 daughters are really energetic, and when they get together, it's like the cameras are rolling. Like, I don't know, they just get everybody, they just get each other so energized. And so then it moves from what they're doing and why they're doing it to remember this and remember that. And so it's really a healing thing for them, to your point, and for me too.
So turning to others who may be walking a journey of their own, wanted to talk about compassion, which you talk about in your book, and it's one of your specific quotes. Compassion is the key to navigating the challenges that dementia presents. Can you talk about that and your own caregiving experience, which you certainly were with Janene?
Well, let me come at that, Adam, kind of from a big picture perspective, because I've had to do a lot of thinking about this, over the last decade, and it seems to me, and people have done a good bit of writing about this, what comprises human flourishing, and it basically boils down, in my mind, to 4 key relationships. The relationship with yourself, relationship, that's the psychological, emotional part. Relationship with others, that's the social part. Some of this is self-evident. Relationship with the transcendent, because there's no way suffering doesn't in some way cause us to review, rethink, reframe, maybe completely disassociate with whatever our religious and spiritual training was. I can't tell you how many atheist friends of mine have said to me, well, aren't you mad at God? And how in the world can a loving God even let something like this happen to a person as healthy as Janene? One of my responses is, I thought you didn't believe in God. So one of the things I'm suggesting is that it's something like Plan B in any suffering brings us into some relationship with the transcendent. However, whatever religious background, however we review that, and then 4th is our relationship with the world. For example, Janene had to stop working. We became a single income family. Literally, to be specific about it, her care cost $80,000 a year. that makes a difference when you're projecting, like it does for so many people, what Alzheimer's and dementia will cost. Mm-hmm. So my compassion for myself and for others came around understanding that diseases and something like dementia attacks every dimension of human flourishing. So I got to be really compassionate to people who just couldn't do it. I had family members who were not able to visit Janene in a memory care facility, and it's really difficult to do.
From a capacity standpoint.
Mm-hmm. They just weren't able to do it.
Situation that you were in certainly didn't fit cleanly in a box.
Doesn't fit that cleanly.
In terms of those answers that people are looking for.
I know. Spiritual bypassing, you know. That's a term that people use now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Some kind of intellectual gymnastics that don't work very well. Because we're faced with the mystery of it, see.
Yeah.
And mystery should bring us to some point of compassion, and here's a big word, another whole topic, but forgiveness. Some people say if you've got to go to a memory care facility, you might have to forgive life itself.
Life itself.
Isn't that a strong term?
It
might
is.
have to just forgive life itself, kind of how it turned out.
Yeah. You talk about different kinds of hope.
Yes.
When I was reading, going back and taking a look at some of your chapters on hope, there's one chapter, Radical Hope. And then you also talk about false hope. Can you describe a moment of hope that has emerged during your journey?
Yeah. I'm not sure I can do this without getting kind of choked up. Is that okay?
It's okay.
When we did 5 days, a full week of diagnostic work with Janene at the University of California at San Francisco, it was the first time in Janene's life that her mind, over the course of a week, was brought to an inability. Janene was exceptionally bright. So if she decided to understand something, she could understand it. So she had gone through PET scans and MRIs, and you know all about that, Adam. Yeah. But at the end of a week, she was completely exhausted and discouraged because she still had some language left. And we went across the street from the downtown San Francisco Diagnostic Center. And we were trying, the three daughters and I, to sort of metabolize what had just happened. And our oldest daughter said, "Dementia will not destroy our family." And it was like an admonition or a proclamation. It was hard to describe how deep that went.
Yeah.
And it didn't, and it hasn't, but it was like coming from one of my daughters. She just said, we're gonna hope not that mom's gonna eventually be okay, but that this really difficult plan B, well, to use the strong word, suffering, is not going to destroy our family. And as you know, these kind of life-altering situations too often destroy families.
Yeah.
So it gave me a real ray of hope right out of the gate, so to speak. That was, I mean, by the time Janene did her diagnostic work, I knew what the outcome was going to be because I had done some research myself. But to have one of the kids just say it so clearly and explicitly, we're going to be a strong family all the way through this, has nothing to do with outcomes. It has to do with who we are. It has to do with our identity. And that's really the basis of hope in these kind of circumstances and situations.
Seems like that was something certainly that you needed in that moment.
It was. It was very much something we needed at that moment. That was a long airplane trip back to Denver.
No doubt.
Actually.
Jay, I know you've had the chance to be a part of dementia support groups during this journey, along with other close allies who have walked beside you. Talk a bit about aloneness that can come naturally when something like dementia happens, and how important it was for you to have a sense of community in the midst of the difficult journey you've walked.
I can't emphasize that enough.
Yeah.
And this goes back to the model of relationship with others. But it turned out that during most of the time as Janene was progressing, as they say, I was in a men's group, a men's support group. And there were about 7 or 8 of us that met every Monday night. And it was dramatically supportive to me. I would report on the latest sort of nuance of Janene's decline and the inevitable, what appeared to be the inevitable need for her to be institutionalized. And they were with me every step of the way. And at times they said, "We're not scared," which is an interesting thing.
Yeah.
It's like, we're not scared. Whatever happens with Janene is not going to be too much for us. We're going to be there for you. Mm-hmm. We're going to meet every Monday night and let us know what you need. So that was sort of the social dimension of it. The psychological and spiritual dimension of the journey for me was to move from loneliness to solitude.
Loneliness to solitude.
Mm-hmm. I did a support group with some guys whose wives had dementia or Alzheimer's, and most of us, some of them, will, when their wives pass away, they sell their place and move because the memories and the loneliness to stay in that physical environment is just overpowering. It's very understandable. I came close to it and decided to stay. And as I stayed and began to attach even more to the land where I live and the place, Janene and I were fortunate enough to get a place with a little bit of acreage. It became, I transitioned out of the emotional intensity of loneliness, and it was more solitude, where I befriended the loneliness, and it took a lot of the power away from it. And you asked me, well, exactly how'd that happen?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Like, I'm not positive how it happened. I mean, there were some spiritual practices. I was walking my dog every morning. It was quiet in the house. I didn't play music in my house after Janene left for like 48 months.
But it was something I guess you did quite often.
She did a lot.
Yeah.
And but solitude is what monks and nuns in any tradition, the Buddhist monks, in the ashrams, they're quiet. But they're not lonely. So I think it comes psychologically through embracing the emotional realities around us and current reality. There's a big gap between aspirations and current reality. And to be able to step into that gap, and like Parker Palmer says, the Quaker educator, he said, if you can step into it, and in some cases it's a pretty tragic gap, very tragic gap. Does your heart break open, or does it break apart? Does it break apart like shrapnel, emotional shrapnel? And we all know people who are especially older people that are bitter and they're not fun to be around? Or have they become more capacious? And there's something about that, more capacity for love and grace and forgiveness and kindness. And those people know something about solitude. They can be with themselves and enjoy being with themselves.
Another quote. Life has taught me it's okay to grieve what we've lost while celebrating what remains. That's a line, Jay, that will evoke a lot of emotion for those who have experienced loss and don't know how to feel about their newfound reality. Can you describe what you meant with this principle, both in your own life and how this can provide hope to others?
That's a really hard question to answer, Adam. You know, a model comes to mind, and this won't shock you, but it has to do with navigating a polarity, actually. And can I celebrate and grieve at the same time? Because the truth of the matter is, as Janene was declining over the course of a decade, my life, I can't imagine my life being more fulfilling as an individual, working part-time with men and leaders like you all over the country. It was like I was in the flow. And was I going to identify so much with the fact that Janene was declining and that was going to be my identity? Mm-hmm. Or could I live right in the vortex between a full life, a healthy full life? I did a couple Ride the Rockies during that. I did 400-mile road bike rides across the Rocky Mountains while she was in a memory care facility.
Yeah.
And felt sad as all get out at times coming down off the peaks, you know, and feeling what an amazing thing that I'm able to do this. And so the capacity to live into the realities and be, maybe another word would be differentiated enough, kind of separate enough emotionally, that I can both enjoy goodness and abundance while there's a lot of scarcity and grief going on at the same time. It's a job, in simple terms, but it's possible to do that.
I think that could be encouraging.
I hope it is encouraging to people.
I think it could be.
That's to be able to approach it, especially when you know it may be chronic and long-term, and kind of organize ourselves psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, professionally around what are the resources that I'll need to bring to bear so that this circumstance does not overpower me and become my identity, to use that psychological word.
Yeah.
That's super important when we're in these longer-term experiences that create the gap or plan B, however we want to talk about it.
I think that could be really insightful and encouraging to people listening. And I wanted to be able to ask you, as we move toward finishing up this podcast, what does moving forward look like for you now?
Wow. Well, I go back to this model of the 4 key relationships. I'm really grateful. I think overall what I would say to people about managing through this and moving forward, it's going deeper in all 4 of those quadrants. Like, find ways to identify your unique abilities and your gifts and capacities and think about a way to contribute with them. Something that just pops in my mind right now, I grew up on a farm in Iowa, and a woman about 20 years lost a 10-year-old son who fell off of one of these huge grain wagons into the grain and suffocated. And what she did with that is have a company. She created a company about child safety in farms. A lot of ways to get hurt if you're a 10-year-old boy on a farm. Mm-hmm. And so she found within herself the strength to do that. Deepen your relationship with family. I have family relationships now that are deeper and better than they would have been had Janene not gotten sick. And I'm not saying that that's a way to do a little intellectual gymnastic, that everything turns out really better.
No, I don't see that. Perhaps redemptive.
Redemptive. That's a great term. Mm-hmm. Go deeper in your relationship, whatever your religious and spiritual tradition is. Kind of dust that off.
Yeah.
And then how can you make a contribution in the world? That's what moving forward is. As paradoxical as it seems, suffering and dementia, in my case, was an opportunity to actually deepen myself in these dimensions of life.
Well, it seems that you're certainly doing that.
The final thing I would say about this is take a larger way was the last sentence that Janene had that actually held together. Mm. Literally. She wasn't able to say anything else except call me on the phone and actually say, take a larger way. And that's a pretty all-inclusive sort of statement. But if I were to say only one thing about people who are facing suffering in Plan B is don't let it make you small. All the ways that we can become shrunken individuals in the face of difficulty and hardship or some kind of suffering. Janene's final word to me was, well, why don't you just use this and take a larger, more inclusive, more well-developed way.
And that was one of the beautiful parts of the book.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it. It's great to talk to you.